Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about an old family picture from 1890 that revealed a terrifying detail when zoomed in. A story that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. For those who believe the past is dead and buried, a relic to be catalogued and forgotten, the town of Salem, Massachusetts, holds a whispered, chilling rebuttal. It is a place where the very air feels weighted, thick with the dust of secrets best left undisturbed. History here is not a closed book gathering dust on a shelf. It is a living, breathing entity, a persistent presence that sighs through the salt-laced wind from the harbor and gazes out from the darkened, mullioned windows of colonial-era homes whose timbers remember the weight of the accusation. It is here, in this crucible of judgment and memory, where the line between history and haunting is impossibly thin, that a story, entombed for over a century, awaited the precise moment to awaken. Rebecca Martinez was not a woman given to flights of fancy. A pragmatist by nature, her relationship with the past was one of scholarship, connoisseurship, and commerce. With over 2 decades navigating the fiercely competitive world of high-end antiques, she had developed an almost clinical detachment. She had crossed the thresholds of countless estates where time had stood still, her mind a swift and silent calculator of provenance and value. She was intimately familiar with the unique silence of dust-sheeted rooms, the complex perfume of decaying paper, dried lavender, and beeswax, and the subtle feeling of being an intruder upon decades of slumber. But the Whitmore estate, from the very first moment, was different. It was not merely old, it was watchful. From the instant the solicitor turned the key in the rusted lock and the heavy oak door groaned open on protesting hinges, a palpable cold emanated from within, a deep, cellular cold that had nothing to do with the crisp New England autumn air. The house, legally sealed since the last of the family line had expired without an heir, seemed to be exhaling a single, held breath, releasing a sorrow it had guarded jealously for generations. As she moved through the grand funereal rooms, the weak afternoon light struggled through grime-caked windows, illuminating the swirling motes of dust in its shafts like wandering spirits. Her practiced eye catalogued the contents with an efficient rhythm, a Steinway grand piano, its keys yellowed and silenced under a shroud of linen, a collection of German porcelain dolls, their painted, unblinking eyes seeming to follow her from behind the glass of a locked cabinet, a vast library of leather-bound books, their spines stiff and unread, their pages holding stories that no one had touched for 100 years. Yet, through it all, she felt an inexplicable pull, a subtle magnetism drawing her away from the easily appraised artifacts in the main rooms and towards a long shadowed hallway at the heart of the house. The temperature here was noticeably colder, the air more still, and it was there, hanging in stark, solitary isolation against the faded, water-stained floral wallpaper. That she found it. A family photograph, housed in an elaborate, tarnished silver frame, its intricate carvings of ivy blackened with age. Below the image, the photographer's elegant mark and a date, written in a delicate, fading sepia script, were just visible: 1890. At first glance, it was a textbook example of late Victorian portraiture, a study in solemnity, A family of 5, frozen in the severe, unsmiling formality of the age. The patriarch, Edmund Whitmore, a man of evident means with a formidable moustache, stood behind his seated wife, Catherine, a hand placed with proprietary stillness upon her shoulder. Their 3 children, 2 adolescent girls, Margaret and Emma, and a younger boy, William, were arranged around them, a carefully constructed tableau of familial order and prosperity. But as Rebecca gently cleaned the glass with a soft cloth, her own breath catching in her throat, the photograph's profound strangeness began to assert itself. It was the quality. The photographic arts of the 1890s, though advancing, were still bound by the limitations of their chemistry. Images were typically soft in focus, grainy, or marred by the imperfections of the glass plates. This portrait, however, was unnervingly, impossibly sharp. It possessed a resolving power that defied the silver-halide chemistry of its day, rendering every thread in their clothing's weave, every intricate carving on their high-backed chairs, with a hyper-realistic clarity that felt utterly, jarringly anachronistic. And then she allowed her gaze to meet theirs. The eyes of the parents were voids, dutifully vacant as they endured the long, motionless seconds of the exposure. But the children's eyes, they were alive. They were wide, not with the innocent wonder of youth, but with a raw, suppressed terror so profound it seemed to vibrate across the century of silence. It was a fear that was active, present, and directed at something specific beyond the photographer's lens. Margaret, the eldest, had a look of defiant horror, her jaw subtly clenched. Emma's was one of wide-eyed incomprehension. But it was the boy, William, whose gaze was the most chilling. It was a look of pure animal terror. This was not a family posing for a portrait. This was a lineup of hostages, their compliance secured by an unseen threat. Rebecca felt the deep cold from the house coalesce within her bones. A single chilling question sliced through the mansion's silence. What force could be so terrifying as to petrify the very souls of children, yet remain utterly invisible, leaving behind only a silent, perfect photograph as its witness? To understand the terror locked within that tarnished silver frame, we must pull our focus back, not just from the image itself, but from the gilded, treacherous era it captured. The late 19th century in America was known as the Gilded Age. It was a masterfully ironic term, coined to describe a society shimmering with the brilliant luster of new wealth, yet corroded by a deep and pervasive decay just beneath the surface. It was the age of Carnegie's steel, Rockefeller's oil, and Vanderbilt's railroads, an age of explosive, unregulated industrial growth that erected cities of unprecedented scale and created fortunes of unimaginable size. New England, with Boston as its proud epicenter, was a powerhouse of this transformation. The textile mills, like those owned by Edmund Whitmore in nearby Lawrence and Lowell, were the engines of this prosperity, their looms weaving not just fabric, but the very fabric of a new American aristocracy. The Whitmore family, as depicted in their flawless portrait, was a perfect emblem of this era's promise. Business ledgers from the period paint a portrait of Edmund Whitmore as a man of immense talent, but also of growing recklessness, a titan of his industry who, in the face of economic headwinds like the Panic of 1890, had begun taking dangerous risks. Their Salem mansion was more than a home. It was a declaration of arrival, a fortress of opulence meant to stand for generations. But the Gilded Age was built on a foundation of brutal contrasts. For every mansion built on Beacon Hill, 1,000 families starved in the squalor of tenement housing. For every fortune made, countless lives were broken in the relentless machinery of progress. This was also an age of violent labor strikes, of devastating financial panics that could erase dynasties in a single afternoon, and of a burgeoning criminal underworld that thrived in the shadows of legitimate commerce. The lack of modern financial regulation and the prevalence of cash transactions created a fertile ground for loan sharks and extortionists, who operated as a shadow banking system, offering vast sums of money to the desperate at a terrifying cost. To these predators, a man like Edmund Whitmore, a member of the new money class, successful but without the deep-rooted connections of the old Boston Brahmins, was not a peer. He was the perfect mark, a high-value target whose potential downfall represented the ultimate prize. That world, with its gleaming promises and its hidden rot, was long gone, but a pristine, terrifying fragment of it now lay on the sterile, brightly lit examination table of Rebecca's workshop in Boston, here, far from the oppressive, watchful silence of the Salem estate. The photograph could be interrogated. The work was slow, methodical, more akin to forensics than to art restoration. She donned a pair of white cotton gloves, her movements precise and reverent, upon carefully removing the photograph from its heavy, ornate frame. The first anomaly became a certainty. The photographic paper, a thick cardstock, was of a quality and durability she had never encountered. She recognized its high rag content. Similar to archival papers used by the government for treaties and legal documents meant to last for centuries, it was made to be a permanent record. With a high-powered, illuminated magnifying glass, a tool that had helped her identify countless forgeries and restorations over the years, she began her slow scan of the image's surface, inch by silent inch. And it was then that the carefully constructed facade of the portrait began to utterly disintegrate. Her focus settled on the mother, Catherine Whitmore. In an era when exposure times demanded a statue-like stillness for several agonizing seconds, any movement was the enemy. Yet, there, on Catherine's left hand, resting in the folds of a dark silk dress, was a telltale softness, a subtle ghostly blur at the edge of her fingers. Rebecca's mind, trained to spot imperfections, raced through the logical possibilities. A flaw in the chemical developing process now. The rest of the image was too perfect. A vibration from the floorboards, unlikely to affect only one small part of the subject. She eliminated every technical explanation until only the human one remained. It was the unmistakable evidence of an involuntary tremor, a vibration born of immense fear or distress, so powerful that not even the iron will of a Victorian matriarch could suppress it. Her heart now beating a little faster, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She guided the lens to the faces of the children once more. Her eyes confirmed her initial horror. The eldest daughter, Margaret, while staring forward, had her hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles visibly white, a small, desperate act of defiance. And the boy, William, was looking away. His gaze was directed sharply to his left, just beyond the frame, his eyes fixed on something unseen. It wasn't the bored, wandering gaze of a restless child. It was a look of intense, fearful concentration, as if he were monitoring a specific point of threat. What, Rebecca wondered, could be happening just outside the camera's view? That was more compelling, more terrifying than the strange man and his explosive magnesium flash powder in front of them. Each discovery was a chisel blow against the portrait's serene surface. The archival paper, the mother's trembling hand, the daughter's clenched fists, the boy's diverted, watchful gaze. These were not accidents. They were clues. They were the discordant notes in a carefully composed symphony, hinting at a terrible, silent conductor standing just off stage. The photograph was not just a picture. It was a testament, a carefully preserved moment of profound psychological torment. Rebecca leaned back from the table, the low hum of the magnifier's lamp filling the quiet room. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was no longer just an antique dealer who had found a curious artifact. She was the custodian of a secret, the first person in over a century to hear the faint, desperate whisper emanating from the past. The silence in Rebecca's workshop was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. The initial whispers from the past had coalesced into a persistent, unnerving hum that seemed to emanate directly from the silver nitrate of the photograph. The object on her workbench had ceased to be an artifact. It was now a presence, an accusation trapped in time. The subtle, horrifying clues she had already uncovered: the mother's psychosomatic tremor, the son's intensely focused gaze, were deeply disturbing, but they remained in the subjective realm of interpretation. They were feelings, impressions, the stuff of ghost stories. For the truth to begin its arduous journey into the light of the present, she needed something objective, something undeniable, something that could not be dismissed as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. This conviction drove her back to the illuminated magnifier, long after the city outside her window had grown quiet. A compulsion, born of a sense of responsibility to the terrified children in the frame, guided her hands. Her examination this time was different, more methodical, more desperate. She forced her focus away from the human drama of their faces and began a systematic sweep of the photograph's environment. The inanimate objects that had served as the silent stage for their final, staged moments. Her lens drifted over the deep-carved mahogany of the chairs, the rich, light-absorbing brocade of the curtains, and finally it settled upon the ornate, gilded mirror hanging on the wall behind the family. In the compositional theory of Victorian portraiture, mirrors were a nuisance, an amateur's mistake that could betray the artifice of the studio by reflecting the camera or the flash. Yet, this one was prominent, its frame catching the ambient light, almost as if it were a second subject. At first, she saw nothing but the distorted floral pattern of the wallpaper. It was an optical dead end. But then, as she shifted the angle of her desk lamp, a sliver of light caught the mirror's surface in a new way, revealing a depth, a perspective that was logically impossible. The reflection was not showing what was behind the family. It was showing something else entirely. Her heart began a heavy, painful drumming against her ribs. She leaned closer, her own reflection a ghostly blur on the magnifying lens. The image within the mirror was a nightmare rendered in ghostly sepia tones. It was not the back of the family's heads, nor the bulky silhouette of a 19th century camera on its tripod. The mirror, impossibly, was reflecting a scene taking place in front of the family. There, standing where the photographer ought to have been, were several indistinct forms. They were human-shaped voids, their features and clothing lost to the shadows and the primitive optics of the era. But their posture spoke a universal language of menace. They were not guests. One of the figures had an arm raised, and from that hand dangled an object that made Rebecca's blood turn to ice, a length of thick, coiled rope, unmistakable in its purpose. Another form seemed to be holding a dark, heavy object, its function terrifyingly ambiguous. They were specters of violence, their presence a fundamental violation of the scene, a contamination of the carefully constructed domestic tranquility. This was not a portrait session. It was an invasion. The mystery had just crossed a terrible and irrevocable threshold, moving from the realm of psychological distress into the stark, cold territory of a documented crime. The weight of this discovery was both physical and metaphysical. Rebecca pushed her chair back, the scraping sound loud in the stillness. The air in the room felt thin, hard to breathe. She was an expert in provenance, in the delicate art of dating furniture, in identifying the subtle marks of a master silversmith. She was not equipped for this. The shadowy figures in the mirror were a declaration that this photograph belonged in a police archive, not an antique shop. She knew, with a certainty that felt like a lead weight in her gut, that she had reached the absolute boundary of her expertise. To cross it, she would need a different kind of guide. That guide came in the form of Dr. James Harrison, a name spoken with a kind of academic reverence in the hallowed halls of Harvard's art history department. Harrison was more than a professor. He was considered the final authority in the esoteric world of 19th century photographic processes. A man who could, it was said, deduce the origin of a photograph from the chemical composition of its emulsion alone. He was a man of science and hard facts, weary of the countless amateur historians and ghost hunters who brought him their proof smudges. Stains and light leaks they insisted were portals to another world. When Rebecca called him, her voice tight with a mixture of scholarly excitement and primal dread, he was professionally, deeply skeptical. Yet, something in the antique dealer's precise, terrified articulation of the details convinced him to make the short drive from the academic sanctuary of Cambridge to her Boston workshop. Upon his arrival, Harrison was the embodiment of scholarly composure, a stark contrast to Rebecca's barely concealed agitation. He listened with a detached patience as she recounted her discoveries, his face a mask of neutrality. Then, without a word, he turned his attention to the photograph. For the next hour, a profound silence enveloped the room, broken only by the soft electronic hum of Harrison's professional-grade equipment and his occasional clipped murmur of fascinating or indeed. He bypassed the simple magnifying glass, instead placing the photograph onto a high-resolution flatbed scanner. A bar of cold, white light crawled slowly across the 130-year-old surface, digitizing every microscopic fiber of the paper, every crystalline particle of silver, translating the past into the language of the present. The image that materialized on his large calibrated monitor was a revelation, magnified to a scale its creator could never have conceived. The photograph began to surrender its deepest, most unwilling secrets. "The paper stock is extraordinary," Harrison stated, his voice a low, analytical hum. "Its thickness and rag content are consistent with archival paper used for government or legal documentation, not private portraiture." His cursor, a precise digital scalpel, hovered over the children's clothing. "And look here," he said, zooming in until the image became a matrix of pixels. "The boy's waistcoat. The fourth button is misaligned with its hole. A small detail, but in a formal setting like this, a significant one. And the eldest daughter's dress. See this deep, vertical crease near the shoulder that doesn't come from sitting. That is the mark of being dressed by another's rough, hurried hands." The pressure in the room was mounting with each new observation. Harrison navigated the digital image to the patriarch, Edmund Whitmore. He bypassed the man's stern, stoic face and focused on his wrists, where they emerged from his starched, white cuffs to the naked eye. Nothing was amiss. But Harrison began applying a series of digital filters, manipulating the contrast, isolating specific light spectra, and then, like a developing image in a darkroom tray, they emerged from the noise. They were faint, but under the unforgiving eye of the software, they were unmistakable, dark, chafed abrasions, forming a distinct ring around both wrists. "These are not shadows," Harrison said, his voice now stripped of all academic detachment, transformed into something colder. "These are not photographic artifacts. These are ligature marks, rope burns." He leaned back from the screen, his face pale. He looked at Rebecca, and in his eyes, she saw her own horror mirrored back at her. "This was not a portrait session, Miss Martinez," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This was a staging, a proof of life, or perhaps a proof of possession. The photograph was now irrevocably transformed. It was no longer a mystery. It was an indictment. But an indictment of whom? And for what crime? This question propelled Dr. Harrison from the clinical environment of the lab into the hushed, sacred halls of the Massachusetts Historical Society archives. Armed with a family name, a year, and a growing sense of dread, he began to dig, not into the history of photography, but into the recorded history of a family. The initial search through public ledgers and society pages from the late 1880s yielded a portrait of a family at the zenith of their prosperity. Edmund Whitmore was a respected, if sometimes feared, figure in the textile industry. They were patrons of the arts, donors to the church, a pillar of the Salem community. Their life, as recorded by the cheerful gossip of the press, was as flawless and composed as the surface of their family portrait. Harrison felt a growing sense of cognitive dissonance. How could this public picture of civic virtue be reconciled with the private terror captured in the photograph? He pressed on, moving his search forward into the autumn of 1890, the period just after the photograph was likely taken. He loaded a reel of microfilm, the brittle celluloid containing the archives of the Boston Daily Globe. The machine whirred to life, and the black and white pages of the past flew by in a dizzying blur. He slowed as he reached October, his eyes scanning the dense, tiny columns of text for any mention of the Whitmore name. A cancelled charity ball, a brief note on a postponed business trip, small, insignificant tremors. And then he turned the knob one more time. The page settled into focus. His search was over. It was not a small notice tucked away in the society pages. It was a headline, stark and brutal, that seemed to scream from the illuminated screen. It was a headline that stopped his heart. Whitmore family vanishes from Salem mansion. Harrison froze. His hand clenched on the reader's knob. The world seemed to shrink to the dimensions of that single, glowing frame of film. The article, dated October 28, 1890, laid out the chilling, impossible facts. The entire family of 5 Edmund, Catherine, Margaret, William, and Emma had disappeared. A concerned business associate, having received no reply to his urgent telegrams for several days, had alerted the authorities. The police had found the grand mansion eerily quiet. Unlocked, there were no signs of a struggle, no robbery. The morning's meal was reportedly still laid out on the dining table, untouched, a feast for the ghosts. It was as if the family had simply stood up from their lives and evaporated into thin air. The story had been a media sensation, dominating the front pages for weeks. The police were baffled. No ransom note ever arrived. No bodies were ever found. No credible witnesses ever came forward. The case grew cold with the coming of the New England winter, eventually sublimating from a criminal investigation into a piece of tragic local folklore. A ghost story told to frightened children. Until this moment, Harrison leaned back in his chair, the low hum of the archive's fluorescent lights suddenly deafening in the silence. The photograph in Rebecca's workshop was not a clue to an old mystery. It was the mystery's final, horrifying chapter. It was, he now realized with chilling certainty, the last known image of the Whitmore family, taken not in a moment of domestic bliss, but in the terrifying twilight hours before they were methodically and completely erased from the ledger of history, leaving behind only a single, silent, and impossibly clear image of their final, captive moments. The discovery in the archives did more than just connect the photograph to a name and a date. It transformed a historical artifact into a key piece of evidence in a 130-year-old quintuple homicide. Dr. Harrison, a man accustomed to the quiet, academic pursuit of the past, now found himself in possession of a truth too terrible to remain confined to scholarly journals. The case of the Whitmore family was no longer a matter for historians or antique dealers. It was a matter for the law. This realization led him and Rebecca Martinez to the office of Detective Sarah Chen, the formidable head of the Massachusetts State Police's newly formed Historical Crimes Unit. Detective Chen was a unique figure in law enforcement, a woman who moved as comfortably through dusty archives as she did through modern forensic labs. She was part historian, part detective, driven by the conviction that murder has no statute of limitations on morality, even when the law dictates otherwise. As she sat in a sparse, functional office, listening to the story unfold, the eerie mansion, the impossibly clear photograph, the figures in the mirror, the ligature marks, the vanishing. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes held a familiar, intense focus. She had seen this before, the past reaching out, demanding a reckoning. When presented with the high-resolution digital scans of the photograph, she didn't see an artifact. She saw a crime scene, and she knew that the tools of the present could force it to finally yield its secrets. The photograph was officially entered into evidence. The investigation moved from the world of academia into the cold, sterile environment of the State Forensic Laboratory. Here, under fluorescent lights and the hum of powerful computers, the past was to be dissected by the present. Chen's team, specialists in computational photography and digital archaeology, subjected the image to a battery of tests its creator could never have fathomed. They ran image enhancement algorithms designed to clarify details hidden in the shadows of the silver nitrate. The results were immediate and chilling. The shadowy figures in the mirror, once indistinct voids, sharpened into focus, while their faces remained obscured. The software could now define their forms with greater certainty. They were, as Rebecca had suspected, men, and they were dressed not in the fine suits of the era, but in dark utilitarian wool, clothing the attire of laborers or hired muscle. The analysis also clarified the object in one man's hand. It was not just a rope, but a thick, heavy-gauge rope, tied with a knot commonly used in maritime rigging or in restraints. This was damning, but Chen knew it was still circumstantial. She needed something more. She needed a voice. She tasked her lead analyst with a seemingly impossible task to scan the entire photograph at a microscopic level, looking for any anomaly, any detail that was not part of the original scene. The perpetrators documented their crime, Chen reasoned, but they couldn't control every variable. Look for something that doesn't belong. For days, the analyst painstakingly scanned every texture, the wood grain, the wallpaper, the fabric, and then he found it. It was not in the main composition, but on the gilded frame of the mirror within the photograph. To the naked eye, it was invisible, lost in the intricate carvings. But the computer, programmed to detect non-native textures, flagged it. A series of faint, deliberate scratches in the wood's surface, almost certainly made by something small and sharp, perhaps a brooch pin. The analyst isolated the scratches and applied a topographical filter, translating the depth and direction of the marks into a readable image. The rendering completed. A hush fell over the lab. The scratches formed two simple, desperate words. It was a message from a ghost. A plea launched into the future like a bottle thrown into the sea. A confirmation of their worst fears, help us. The message in the mirror was the first direct communication from the victims. A voice that had been silenced for over a century. It was irrefutable proof of foul play. But to understand the full scope of the horror, Chen knew she had to return to the source. The digital world had given her evidence, but the physical world, the Whitmore mansion itself, held the context. armed with a warrant and accompanied by a forensic archaeology team. Chen crossed the threshold of the Salem estate, not as a guest or a historian, but as a homicide detective entering a sealed crime scene. The house was no longer just an eerie, preserved relic. It was now an active investigation site. The team swept the mansion with technology that would have seemed like witchcraft in 1890. Ground-penetrating radars scanned the cellar floor for disturbed earth. Ultraviolet light sources searched for traces of biological evidence that might have impossibly survived the passage of time. The search was meticulous, yielding little beyond the dust of ages. But Chen, guided by an investigator's intuition, was drawn to the basement. It was cold, damp, and filled with discarded remnants of a forgotten life. It was here, in a far corner, beneath a stack of rotting wooden crates, that a floorboard sounded hollow under her feet. Prying it open, they found not a hidden safe or a secret passage, but a small tin box, miraculously protected from the damp. Inside, nestled amongst a child's preserved keepsakes, a porcelain doll, a ribbon, a collection of seashells, was a small leather-bound diary. A silver-plated clasp on its cover was engraved with a single name, Margaret. It was the diary of the eldest Whitmore daughter, 14 years old at the time of her disappearance. As Chen carefully opened the book, the brittle pages threatening to crumble at her touch, she knew she was about to hear the story not from the perspective of an investigator or a historian, but from the heart of the tragedy itself. The early entries were filled with the typical concerns of a privileged teenage girl of the era: notes on her studies, frustrations with her younger siblings, descriptions of dresses for upcoming social events. But as the entries for 1890 progressed, the tone began to darken. Margaret wrote of hushed, angry arguments between her parents late at night. She wrote of strange, unkind men who came to visit her father, men who did not remove their hats indoors and whose voices were low and menacing. A palpable sense of fear began to seep into the pages. The family's grand home slowly transforming into a gilded cage. Chen turned to the final entry. It was dated October 27, 1890, the day the photograph was taken. The handwriting, once neat and controlled, was now a barely legible scrawl. The pencil strokes dug deep into the paper with frantic pressure. This was not a diary entry. It was a final testament. As Detective Chen read the words, the clinical detachment of a profession dissolved, replaced by a profound and heavy sorrow. The voice of Margaret Whitmore, silent for 130 years, finally spoke its truth. They came back today with a cameraman. Papa is crying in his study. They made us dress in our finest and said we must smile for a picture. They told Mama it was for the insurance, a record of their property. Mama says to be brave, to do as they say. I can hear them talking in the hall about what happens next, about a journey. I am so scared. I fear we won't see another sunrise. If anyone ever finds this, please remember us. Remember us as we were, not as they want us to look. Margaret's diary was the confession the case had lacked for over a century. It was a direct, first-hand account of the family's final hours, confirming that the photograph was a calculated act of psychological torture, a prelude to their murder. The phrase, "a record of their property," was the key. It led Chen back to the archives, but this time, her search was not for headlines of a disappearance, but for the dry, legal records of Edmund Whitmore's business dealings. There, in the dusty ledgers of court filings and loan agreements, she found the truth. In the year leading up to his family's disappearance, Edmund's textile empire had been failing. Desperate, He had taken a series of massive loans, not from a bank, but from a private investment syndicate, a group of wealthy Boston businessmen with questionable backgrounds and deep connections to the city's criminal underworld. The names listed on the loan documents were a revelation. They were the founding fathers of some of Boston's most prominent families, their names now adorning university halls and hospital wings. They had operated a sophisticated, ruthless loan sharking and extortion ring under the guise of legitimate finance. When a high-profile debtor like Whitmore defaulted, he was not simply taken to court. He and his entire family were erased. It was a monstrously effective business model, designed to send a chilling message to their other clients: debt would not be tolerated. The Whitmores were not their first victims, and records suggested they were not their last. Detective Chen had solved it. She had the motive, the method, and the names of the men responsible. She had the entire shape of one of the most brutal and sophisticated criminal enterprises in 19th century New England. But with this victory came a profound, frustrating powerlessness. The perpetrators were long dead, their crimes protected by the unbreachable barrier of time. No criminal charges could be filed. The legal system could offer no retribution. But justice, Chen knew, takes many forms. Working with the district attorney's office, she prepared a comprehensive and official report on the Whitmore family case, detailing every piece of evidence, from the forensic analysis of the photograph to the final, heartbreaking words of Margaret's diary. The report, officially closing the 130-year-old cold case, was released to the public. It landed like a bombshell on the manicured lawns of Boston's high society. The descendants of the investment syndicate, living lives of inherited privilege, were now confronted with the monstrous foundation of their family fortunes. The scandal was immense. There were no arrests, but there was a reckoning. In the months that followed, several of the implicated families made quiet, substantial, and anonymous donations to victims' rights organizations and historical preservation societies, a silent, modern-day penance for the sins of their forefathers. The public release of Detective Chen's official report was not an endpoint, but a moment of profound and painful redefinition. For over a century, the Whitmore family had existed in a state of suspended tragedy, their story relegated to the spectral realm of folklore, a cautionary tale whispered by Salem locals to explain the deep chill of an old, abandoned house. They were phantoms, defined only by the gaping mystery of their absence. But now, with the stark, brutal truth laid bare for the world to see, they were resurrected in the public consciousness, not as apparitions, but as human beings of flesh and blood. They were no longer the vanished Whitmores. They were the murdered Whitmore family, victims of a calculated and monstrous greed that had hidden for generations behind a veneer of societal respectability. This shift was seismic. The very foundations of a local legend collapsed, and, in its place, a somber, unshakable, historical truth began to take shape. This redefinition was most poignantly realized not in the flurry of newspaper headlines or the scandalized whispers of Boston's elite, but in a simple, long overdue ceremony of remembrance. Distant relatives of the Whitmore and Catherine's families, people who had only known their ancestors as names on a genealogical chart, were located and brought together by the sheer gravity of the discovery. On a crisp autumn afternoon, under the same slanted light that had illuminated the family's final days, a small crowd gathered at a Salem cemetery. There were no bodies to bury, no casket to lower into the earth. Instead, a simple, elegant granite memorial stone was erected, its polished surface engraved with the names of Edmund, Catherine, Margaret, William, and Emma. For the first time in 130 years, their names were spoken aloud, not as part of a question, but in an act of mourning. The ceremony was a quiet, powerful reclamation of dignity, a final, definitive statement that these were lives that had been lived with purpose, and that their loss was a tragedy that mattered far beyond the confines of a cold case file. The photograph, the silent catalyst for this entire resurrection of truth, had finally completed its tumultuous journey with a sense of profound reverence. Rebecca Martinez formally donated the artifact to the Massachusetts Historical Society. She could never again see it as a mere commodity, a curiosity to be appraised and sold. It was, she stated to the Historical Society's board, a sacred object, a family's final, desperate message in a bottle, which had finally found its shore. The Society accepted it not as a piece of photographic art, but as a key historical document of a crime and its resolution. It was placed within a climate-controlled vault, resting alongside Margaret's diary. The two artifacts, the image of terror and the words of truth, were at last reunited, their silent conversation now fully understood by the world. The legacy of the Whitmore case extended far beyond the restoration of one family's stolen story. It left an indelible, life-altering mark on the three individuals who had pulled its secrets from the shadows. For Rebecca Martinez, the experience was a professional and personal watershed. She went on to establish the Whitmore Project, a foundation dedicated to funding and promoting the ethical research of historical artifacts with potentially significant human stories attached. She used her platform to champion the idea that antique dealers are not merely merchants, but custodians of memory, and that some memories demand more than a price tag. They demand justice. Dr. James Harrison's comprehensive academic paper on the case, The Whitmore Photograph, a study in forensic iconography, became a landmark text. It masterfully wove together photographic analysis, forensic science, and socio-economic history, and fundamentally altered the study of the Gilded Age. It forced a generation of historians to look beyond the grand biographies of robber barons and industrialists, and to search for the stories of those who were consumed by the relentless machinery of their ambition. And for Detective Sarah Chen, the Whitmore investigation became the cornerstone of her career. The Historical Crimes Unit, once a niche, experimental division, was now recognized as a vital tool for uncovering the past. It became a model for similar units across the nation, creating a new and respected field of forensic history. Her work affirmed her deepest conviction that the passage of time does not diminish the gravity of a crime, and that the determined pursuit of truth has no expiration date. Yet, even with the central mystery brought to a definitive close, a haunting legacy of unanswered questions remains. The full extent of the syndicate's reign of terror and the true number of their other victims may never be known. Their names and stories likely lost to deliberately destroyed records and the silence of time. And a single, tragic loose thread continues to trouble historians: the fate of the photographer, Marcus Crane. His own disappearance in late 1890, so soon after the Whitmores, strongly suggests he too was a victim, a loose end, silenced by his monstrous employers. He remains the second tragedy of the photograph, a talented artist trapped in an impossible position, forced to turn his craft into a weapon and to document an atrocity. Was the impossible clarity of the photograph his final, defiant act of artistic integrity? Or was it simply the work of a terrified man, his soul already broken, complying with his captor's demands? His story, unlike the Whitmores, remains a whisper, a lingering secret the past has not yet chosen to surrender. And so, we are left with a photograph that is no longer just a picture. but a philosophical object. It serves as a powerful, chilling reminder that behind every historical artifact, behind every dusty object in an antique shop or a forgotten attic, there lies a human story. Most are stories of quiet, ordinary lives, but some, like this one, are stories of profound injustice, waiting patiently for a curious eye, a determined mind, or a new technology to finally unlock them. Margaret Whitmore's final, desperate wish was not for revenge, but for remembrance. "Remember us as we were," she wrote, "not as they want us to look." Thanks to the unlikely convergence of conscientious antique dealer, a brilliant historian, and a dedicated detective, her plea was finally profoundly answered. The Whitmore family is at last remembered not as the subjects of a terrifying portrait, frozen forever in a moment of coerced compliance, but as a loving family whose lives were stolen by greed and violence, and whose memory, rescued from the darkness, deserves to be honored. The story of the Whitmore photograph forces us to ask a final, unsettling question. How many other truths are hiding in plain sight, locked away in the silent, everyday objects that surround us? How many other voices are trapped in the emulsion of old photographs, in the faded ink of forgotten letters, in the very fabric of the homes we live in? The past is never truly past. It is merely dormant, waiting in the stillness for the moment when we are finally ready to look closer and to listen.